Hello, welcome to CashcroftTV. My name is Kalen Ashcroft. Thanks for watching another video on history of leaders of thought. Today we will be doing Xenophon and Plato. So starting off with Xenophon, because as per usual he was born slightly before Plato, so obviously working in somewhat chronological order with a few exceptions. So he is most famous for being the general of the army of 10,000. So the army of 10,000 was a mercenary army that had particularly in his case, a large influence on the civil war in Persia. And I think, for example, if you've seen, there's many modern references to it. For example, I think the Unsullied are based on the army of 10,000, except the real army of 10,000 didn't have to be castrated, which I would say would be a nice perk. But nonetheless, he was an extremely important and famous tactician. He was the first to use flanking, feints, and attacks in depth. So one of the greatest before Alexander the Great. So he was also a student of Socrates, and along with Plato and Xenophon were pretty much the only two to actually have written on Socrates, so they are the two sources of Socrates. So although we covered Socrates in a previous video, actually the last video if you're watching these in order, today we'll talk a little bit more about Socrates as well. Additionally, he was amongst being a philosopher and a great general, he was also a historian. So he's very well known for firstly completing the history of the Peloponnesian War, which Thucydides started, which I covered in the previous video, but also his recounts of the Persian Civil War as well are very important, among other things, and his biography of Cyrus the Great, a different Cyrus. And yeah, so he was born in Athens, but despite this, he was actually a big supporter of Sparta. And there are a few reasons for this. Firstly, because at the time, Athens was going through a sort of very pro-democratic movement, in that a lot of powerful people were getting kicked out of the land, even killed in some cases, as you'll see with Socrates. And he was pro-oligarchy, so he thought that the people had gone too far, and Sparta at the time was a very strong oligarchy, and they ultimately won the Peloponnesian War, so he thought they had a better government too. Similarly, he was also a fan of Agesilaus, who I covered in Plutarch's Lives as well, who was a great Spartan general. He's called the Attic Muse because he wrote in very simple, whereas most previous historians or philosophers wrote in a hexameter. Usually he wrote in simple plain Greek, so it's actually, for those who are looking to learn Greek, it is one of the main sources for typical writing, or at least typical writing of the time. So he said he came from a wealthy equestrian family, so meaning his family was involved with the cavalry or in some way, so he was quite wealthy, but probably not wealthy enough to maintain himself as a oligarch, especially perhaps because the oligarchs were having such a hard time with the pro-democratic movement. But at one point his friend suggests that he goes to, so in Persia there was the king was about to be overthrown by his brother Cyrus the Younger. So Cyrus the Younger recruited the army of 10,000 amongst many other generals and satraps, what they're called, who are like essentially local officials. So Xenophon asked Socrates whether he should go and fight for the army of 10,000 and support the civil war, or support the overthrowing of the king for Cyrus the Younger. And Socrates says to him, go speak to the oracle. And when he goes to the oracle, obviously the oracle of Delphi, which was sort of the main religious authority, sort of kind of like, I would say, the Pope at that time, in terms of religious authority and autonomy. So he goes to the oracle and asks, he doesn't ask whether he should go, he asks the oracle which god should he pray to. So he goes back and he says to Socrates, this god told me to go. Socrates obviously gets very upset because he sort of deceived Socrates and didn't ask the right question. But I think it's indicative of his character. Firstly, he was ambitious. He didn't want to leave it up to fate whether or not he went. He wanted to go regardless. So he rephrased the question and obviously sort of upset Socrates in that regards. And so ultimately he went, and Cyrus the Younger unfortunately lost, or fortunately, depending on which side you support, he lost a lot of support from the Persians because many of the Persians did not support him overthrowing his brother. So it ultimately resulted in pretty much just the army of 10,000 against the whole Persian army. And evidently they lost despite the army of 10,000 fighting very well. But Cyrus the Younger was killed in the battle. So the army of 10,000 was sort of left stranded with the individual who was supposed to pay them. Cyrus the Younger was dead, and they had to sort of march back to Greece through some very dangerous territories. So they slowly walked back through, particularly Armenia, and they practiced they had the first use of, well, flanking during the war, but also in terms of their retreat, they would one particular battle, they made it themselves seem super weak. So as they were retreating, they would not fight back. They would not fight back until they got pushed and pushed and pushed until the right time, and then the Persians realized they were a lot stronger than they really did. So they sort of faked their retreat. On another occasion, they came up to a river, and they were pretty much surrounded, and they were worried that they would die. So what he did, and it was a big sacrifice that proved to be meritorious, was he killed all the cows and sheep and goats and all of their food and filled them up with hay and put them on the river and walked across them. So there they were walking through, ultimately to Armenia on their way back to Greece, and they had to fight so many decisive battles where they had very little food and very little supplies, but they managed to make it back to Greece as the result of Xenophon's great leadership and great military tactics. Particularly the Carduchians in Turkey were also a very formidable opponent who had caused a lot of, or had achieved many great successful battles and were rarely ever defeated, and the army of 10,000 made it back. And supposedly Xenophon got this role when he was only 30, so quite a big achievement for a young individual. He wrote this book later in his life. So after he sort of finishes his career as a mercenary soldier, he sort of becomes a historian, and he wrote this one book in particular, Cyropedia, which is a biography of Cyrus the Great. So not Cyrus the Younger, the one who hired them, trying to overthrow his brother and become Persian king, but Cyrus the Great. And basically a lot of it is considered to be pretty perhaps not true, because it conflicts with Herodotus, who is a more reliable historian. But what it sort of shows is perhaps Xenophon's philosophy regarding politics and leadership. And one of them, particularly with regards to Cyrus the Great, he saw that Cyrus the Great was sort of such a great leader that could almost not be replicated. So he sort of saw that empires and monarchies were actually not the best. So obviously, despite him not supporting the democracy back in Athens and supporting the oligarchy in Sparta, he wasn't exactly a supporter of monarchy or tyranny. He was sort of actually somewhat in the middle. So he was not really an extremist in that regards. And it's although maybe perhaps not true, it's one of the greatest pieces of writing. And that is why, although Herodotus might have been more to the point, perhaps Xenophon better captured the objective of history, which is to inspire people. And that's sort of what it did. And that's why, for example, for the longest time, Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, and also Hesiod's writings were so great, maybe perhaps because most of it wasn't even true. They inspired people, and people enjoyed reading them. Even, for example, in Xenophons, he spoke of centaurs, and obviously, at the time, a lot of writers had to incorporate sort of mythological figures, but the concept of the centaur were that the Persian soldiers, a good Persian soldier, should never get off his horse, so he was essentially tied to it. And originally it had a sort of derogatory term, but he sort of saw there was a certain pride in the centaurs. So once again, sort of mythological, but it inspires people, and it made for a great read, and perhaps one of the reasons why you can still read it today. So going back to his concept of democracy, was this thing called homotimoi, which was that equal distribution of rewards for all the victories. So he thought this was sort of untrue. He thought that there needed to be a sort of meritocracy. So, for example, a soldier who does great, defends a lot of people or meets a lot of objectives should perhaps get more spoils. And this is kind of contrary to the sort of democratic movement that was sort of establishing in Athens at the time, in that everyone is deserved equal things. And you later, this history just keeps repeating itself. Pretty much any society, there's sort of a left wing and a right wing, and this is sort of he's kind of an early opponent to what later becomes socialism. So he saw that was not true, and he thought that soldiers should get what they're due based on their merit. Here's a kind of reference to his love for Sparta. It occurred to me one day that Sparta, though among the most thinly populated states, was evidently the most powerful and most celebrated city in Greece, and I fell to wondering how this could have happened. But when I considered the institutions of the Spartans, I wondered no longer. So if you've seen the previous video I made, it was one of the earlier ones I made, so it's very short, but it covers the point, I believe. Lycurgus, who was one of the first lawgivers of Sparta, he sort of made these really finite institutions, and it lasted all the way up to Sparta's ultimate decline. But he sort of saw that these powerful institutions were necessary in order to keep the democracy in check. And he saw that it wasn't even his own state. He respected it more, and he really respected Agesilaus, who was one of the great generals there. In terms of his relationship with Socrates, so Socrates and Plato both were huge fans of... Plato and Xenophon were huge fans of Socrates. They both wrote of him. But Socrates' actual favorite student was Alcibiades, who is covered in Plutarch's Lives. And this is probably sort of an ironic feature of sort of the mentorship. Xenophon and Plato were very supportive and always pretty much agreed with Socrates on every front, but it seems like Socrates seemed to have loved his most difficult student, that being Alcibiades. So Alcibiades was very prone to pleasure. He would always party, always drink. He was sort of a sex addict, you could call, and he was always trying to hold him back. But for that reason, he was his favorite student. It's sort of a disconnect that I think is pretty common. I think it's also common in families. Perhaps the most difficult child or the most rebellious child is perhaps the most loved, maybe because they struggle the most. So in terms of his first meeting with Socrates, apparently he was walking through the street, and Socrates blocks him, and he says, where can I find all kinds of necessary things sold? And Xenophon says, he gives an answer, and I believe it's probably like the market or something. And then he asks, Xenophon is asking these questions, where men make good and virtuous, and Xenophon doesn't know. And Socrates says to him, follow me. So from that point, since it seemed as though Socrates was able to answer a question that Xenophon was not able to answer, he followed him until his ultimate death. And Plato and Xenophon were supposedly both not even at the deathbed of Socrates, but they had a sort of different take on it. Xenophon sort of thought, and he sort of shamed Socrates a little bit because he thought he had a way out, and he didn't do everything that was necessary of him. It was probably, he believed, maybe his moral obligation to stay alive and to fight it, whereas Plato sort of has no contention or doesn't disagree with Socrates on everything and thinks everything he did was meritorious. So that's a little difference, but I'll get to that more in the comparison. So I suppose we'll move on to Plato, and I'll explain this more in the comparison. So obviously, I have no doubt you've heard of Plato, very, very famous philosopher. So he was the founder of the Academy, which was probably the first Western academic institution. He was Socrates is obviously famous for being one of Socrates' students, but he was also the teacher of Aristotle, who was maybe even the most famous philosopher of all time. Also, in terms of further influence, Neoplatonism was heavily influenced on Platonius and Porphyus, which ultimately led into St. Augustus. So it's also into the Christian religion, but it's pretty much in everything that we believe today. And that's why I'll probably focus more on the things that are different from today's society than those that are similar. So like similar common ethics, I think you'd probably agree with and wouldn't need to be explained in too much detail. And plus, there's all of Plato's, or supposedly all of his writings, still last to this day. So this is very uncommon for someone this long ago, over 2,400 years ago, and pretty much since the day he first got fame until today, people are still studying him to this day. Here I am, still 2,400 years later, still looking into him. So pretty much an unbroken following, which is quite impressive. So here's a quote that pretty much sums it up by Alfred North Whitehead. The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So pretty much everything comes back to Plato. And in effect, to Socrates, it's very hard to determine what was actually Plato's ideas and what was actually Socrates, because Socrates wrote nothing and Plato was sort of the one who wrote for him. And maybe it was sort of this ultimate sacrifice in that he said, this is not my writings, these are Socrates' writings that made him so great. And obviously I talk a lot about the artistic component, sort of doing something a little different to make it more long lasting, rather than just writing a bunch of like rules, which would be harder to make long lasting. He was also one of the first to sort of push forward the dialogue or dialectic approach to philosophy, in which people sort of go through negative hypothesis. So they deduce the right answer. They don't create a hypothesis and then try to cancel the hypothesis. They shut down hypotheses to see what can be believed. So sort of a first principles approach. He was, in terms of his influencers, obviously he's most known for being heavily influenced by Socrates, but he was also very heavily influenced by Pythagoras, maybe even more so. Also, Heraclitus and Parmenides had a big influence on his philosophical discussions. So he was born up from an aristocratic family and wealthy family, which is probably necessary, because if he was born in a poorer class, firstly, it would have been hard to associate with people such as Socrates, even though Socrates didn't come from a necessarily high upbringing. But if he had to work in the fields all day, it would have been hard for him to be sitting down thinking of all these abstract topics. Diogenes Laertius, he wrote pretty much the lives of philosophers, which is probably one of the greatest books of all time, up there with Plutarch's Lives in terms of thinkers, kind of parallel to this series, I would say, making an effort to cover all of those lives. But he says that his father was Ariston, who was a descendant of a former king of Athens, Codrus. So maybe this is true, maybe it's not. Maybe in hindsight, sort of, it's kind of like the Pareto distribution. Once somebody gets famous, people start attributing everything to this. Oh, he was a descendant of a king and all this. So those who have everything more will be given. Those who have nothing more will be taken as well. So his mother was Perictione, who is supposedly a descendant of Solon, who was an ancient lawmaker in Athens, who I actually covered. He's one of the first lives in Plutarch's Lives. And he was one of the early lawmakers who ultimately got rid of draconian policies, which was like, steal something, lose your hand. So draconic measures. So obviously a good descendant. But once again, is it true? It perhaps doesn't even really matter, because I would say perhaps assume it's true, and then because it just makes it a better story. So apparently, also his mother, sister, and niece were closely related to the 30 tyrants. So following the Peloponnesian War, the in backlash to the large democratic movements, there was 30 tyrants who tried to take over Athens and ultimately did for a short period. So he sort of had a lot of oligarchs in his sort of family, and that you can kind of see in his sort of philosophy. It's said that his father, Ariston, forced himself on his wife, Perictone, and apparently Apollo came to him in his sleep and told him not to. So maybe this is kind of saying, or kind of turning Plato's lives into a sort of myth where maybe he's some kind of demigod, some descendant of Plato. Whether it's true or not, I think the real essence of this is that his father was not so kind to his mother, and maybe they're trying to put a more positive spin on it. But nonetheless, he had 2 brothers and 1 sister, most notably Glaucon, who's actually an important character in many of his writings. A lot of the time Socrates has discussions with Glaucon, and he's sort of has a often differing opinion, so obviously doesn't express his own opinion, so he's sort of a necessary figure. Also Aedymatus, who is also sometimes in his writings, and his sister Potone, and supposedly Glaucon was older than him, perhaps even his other brother. Perhaps these were even his uncles, but I think it's mostly considered that they're his brothers. But either way, his name Plato, often he had this nickname called Platon, which means broad. So maybe he had a broad chest because he was a wrestler. It said that he perhaps even competed in some competitive games, or maybe it was a reference to his broad forehead, which kind of alludes to one's intellect, or maybe it just was a common name at the time. It had no real significance, but either way, he was sometimes called Platon. So as a student, he was bright, but he was also very modest. So this kind of contrasts Socrates' other student, Alcibiades, who was in no ways modest, and maybe that's why he wasn't really, despite being probably Socrates' most important student, not necessarily his favorite student. But he was given, since he was wealthy, the best education. He was, which would have consisted of grammar, music, and gymnastics, which ultimately led into his athletics, which is kind of, I think, we don't really see this today. I think the top intellectuals don't really see the importance of physical activity in their daily lives, whereas for these individuals, one had to be sort of a polymath. You got to be good at everything. And you also see this also in many other great thinkers, such as Leonardo da Vinci, who also exercised and lift weights, and also some of the founding fathers of the United States, like Benjamin Franklin, would exercise and such. So I think it's an important component. But I think it's just indicative of their character that they were, to put it any other way, tryhards. They gave an effort at every component of life. So he was perhaps a student also alongside, he very much believed in Pythagorean beliefs, but also Cratylus, Cratylus was a student of Heraclitus, so he sort of got into that whole dialogue, which I'll talk about very soon, the becoming and being, which is the Parmenides Heraclitus sort of debate. Supposedly he was perhaps a student of Jeremiah in Egypt, who was a sort of pseudo-bibliological figure, but maybe that's where he got some of his sort of mathematical predisposition, so he was also very interested in mathematics. But that was later opposed by some figures such as St. Augustus. So he pretty much lived his younger life just being a good student and working very hard, and then he traveled a lot. He went to Italy, Sicily, and Egypt, and he ultimately, when he was older, started the academy, which is sort of the first school. And here's a picture of it where they would sort of all just sit down in these circles and have these dialogues and debate and see what can be believed, and sometimes it would also get very abstract. And one thing in terms of politics where he did get involved was, and I talk about this in the Life of Dion, or as does Plutarch. So Syracuse had a sort of a string of a lot of tyrants, such as Dionysius and Dion, and at one point Plato was asked to be a tutor for one of the tyrants, and he almost gets killed there, but he makes a good effort, and it sort of shows, and I think a similar thing to Socrates, and kind of maybe a parallel to his teacher, was that he was willing to die or put his life at risk for his ideals and the things he believed, which is a nice thing. It sort of makes him sort of above human, or above just an intellectual. rather than one guy who just sits around talking all day, someone who's willing to put their life at risk and put their ideas into action. And in terms of his death, he obviously wasn't killed in that conflict. He narrowly escaped, but he died supposedly at 81, perhaps at some wedding or having some nice Thracian girl playing flute to him. So apparently he had a nice death, sort of quite different from that of Socrates. So as mentioned earlier, he was a Pythagorean, and the Pythagorean was sort of like a cult. To become a Pythagorean, you had to do these certain rituals. There was sort of a hazing period. Often they had to stick to a strict diet, which consisted usually of no meat unless it was a certain special sacrifice meat. It's not sure if Plato was actually a Pythagorean or he just had the same beliefs or had teachers who were Pythagoreans, but he sort of believes in the sort of metapsychosis that the Pythagoreans believe in, where sort of there's an eternal soul and reincarnation, which was a very common Pythagorean belief, but also in terms of his beliefs in mathematics. He thought that, very much like the Pythagoreans, that numbers were sort of the foundation of the universe, but there's also two components of mathematics, and Plato is actually one of the first to really divide it. There's the arithmetic sort of component, which is like 1 + 1 is 2, but then there's also numerology, which is like numbers have a certain meaning and represent certain objects. And to kind of expand on this, these are the four major elements. There's earth, water, air, fire, and then there's the fifth element, which I'll talk about in a sec. But each of these elements are associated with a shape. So the earth is associated with the cube, the air is associated with the octahedron, water is associated with the icosahedron, and fire is associated with the tetrahedron. And then there's sort of a fifth element, which is not sort of this earth, which is the dodecahedron, and that's sort of the heavens, sort of. So in terms of numerology, each sort of physical thing or numbers have a meaning beyond just their mathematical or arithmetic usage. So in terms of his discussion with Heraclitus and Parmenides, so as you might have seen in the previous videos, Heraclitus believed that, for example, one never steps in the same river twice, because everything is changing, and change is inevitable. Change is the only real truth, and nothing really exists. Everything is in constant influx, constant change. Whereas Parmenides completely disagreed and said that there is no such thing as change. All that exists is what is here, and change cannot be proven. So Plato sort of took his own take on this, and sort of, I would say, he definitely disagreed with Parmenides in saying that motion does exist. So he disagreed with Parmenides in that, but he saw that motion and rest both exist. So he saw that Heraclitus wasn't necessarily wrong, but he was wrong in that things do exist. And to that, there's sort of the every object has its there's the apparent world, which one perceives through their senses, and then there's the unchanging and unseen world, which is sort of like abstractions. So this, I think, is like a good way to explain it is like, for example, there's rock, or a rock doesn't really exist, because every rock is different, but there's rockness. There is the category of rock. There is hard. There is descriptions, which are sort of unseen but abstract terms, which one cannot observe through their senses. Other things that this applies to is justice, truth, and beauty, but also colors. Like there is rock is red. Perhaps it would be a strange rock, but rocks can be red, I suppose. Rock red, rock hardness, redness. So there's the unseen world and the abstract. And he thought to get true wisdom, one has to sort of not completely ignore their senses and try to learn as much as possible, try to think. And the knowing, in terms of epistemology, the only thing one can know is to get rid of their senses and just to learn more. And this sort of leads into the Socratic irony in that Socrates was considered the smartest person in the world, but he said that he knew less than anyone. So the more you know, the less you know, which is sort of a paradox in one sense. it's called the the Euthyphro dilemma. So he has this. I think it's an important sort of paradox. Is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is the pious pious because it is loved by the gods? So this is kind of a question of morality. Is good sort of within, or is good given to you by God? And it's impossible to prove, but these are sort of questions that are discussed in many of his dialogues and sort of get one to think sort of about one's existence. In terms of his politics, as I mentioned earlier, I think probably the first book on philosophy I ever read was Machiavelli's The Prince, which isn't even, I guess it would be called philosophy, it's more political philosophy. But the next book, which was also similar genre, was Plato's Republic, which was a fantastic book I would recommend to anyone, especially if you are sort of newer to philosophy, and it would sort of fit good context to observe further philosophers, especially considering when it was made. But some of the things he hypothesized, so similar to Xenophon and Socrates, he thought that the democracy was dangerous, and he thought all democracies would eventually crumble into tyranny, because unless there is some sort of divide between those with power and those without, people will seek power infinitely and eventually cause destruction. And this is a very Thomas Hobbes. You read Leviathan, he believed that too. He thought that for example, the monarch had to be separate from the state, because if the monarch is not existent or not separate from the state, greed would take over, and eventually there will be a tyrant who just wants more and more power. There needs to be something separate. So he believed that there should be, going back to Plato believed there should be three classes. There is the productive class, the workers, the protective class, the guardians, and the governing class, the philosophical kings. And these are represented by the three abstractions, which is appetite, which is the workers, spirit, which is the guardians, and reason, which is the philosophical kings. So going back to sort of his contrast with democracy, he thought that one of the problems with voting for people, for example, is that rhetoric and persuasion could lead someone to rule, when really it should be reason. It could be the deaf, blind person who has a lisp, who might actually be the best person to be king, the best person to be philosophical king. So that's why I think a pretty valid issue he has with democracy. And also in terms of the philosophical king, he thought that the king has to be come from the guardian class, but they have to be trained in a certain way, and they have to be trained from a youth. It's very hard to develop the skills to be a leader later. So he's sort of hypothesizing that if one's like a worker their whole life, especially during their particularly important developmental years, their capacity to be a king or a good king is very difficult. And that's another thing that he really talks about in Republic. How should each of these classes be brought up? So, for example, the philosophical kings, at first he's like, is it fair if the philosophical kings live a life of luxury and get all the food they want? And he actually argues yes, because if the philosophical kings are deprived of money or deprived of anything, they will become greedy. So they sort of have to have everything to begin with. But also he even gets so far, and I mentioned this earlier, and something I also say, don't believe everything a philosopher says. He also believed heavily in the censorship. So he thought that even Homer and Hesiod, who were they were almost like wrote the Bibles at the time, because those were the most important stories. He thought that those should be censored, because although there were many great lessons that could be learned in those, they were not perfect, and they could be interpreted wrong. So he thought that he thought that music, he thought that literature and everything should be censored to optimize the state. And not entirely untrue, but I think I used this example in the previous video. To be blind of evil is worse than to have the evil. So, for example, if people only listened to great and glorious music and whatnot, and they never read about evil, which does exist in great literature, they will be blind to it, and when it does happen, which is almost inevitable, they will not know how to deal with it. So in this regard, I do disagree with Plato, and also I think the grounds of censoring any sort of art just to be cruel or unethical. And obviously for his state, it would be a great state with the warrior guardian class, the worker class, and the leader class. It would be very functional, and perhaps it would even ultimately end up conquering other states, like another state that doesn't have censorship or doesn't have these distinct classes. Ultimately, maybe it would be destroyed by this state. So maybe I'm wrong, and this is the ideal state. But I think it's firstly, censoring music and art is unethical. I think people need to express these things, and I think to hide any sort of evil from people would put society at greater risk. And yeah, so lastly, one other reason why he didn't like Homer and Hesiod was that he believed more in logic rather than myth, and that was one of the main divergences we saw through history. And that's why Hesiod and Homer I didn't include in this, because they were great writers, but I'm not really trying to talk about artists here, or like Tolstoy is I would include Dostoevsky because he's kind of more of a psychologist, but I wouldn't necessarily include Tolstoy. Maybe I will include Tolstoy, but Tolstoy is more of an artist than a philosopher. But we'll see. That's still many videos in the future. So one last thing I want to talk about is the ring of Gyges or Gyges. So this is a ring that supposedly allows an individual to become invisible. So his brother Glaucon asks him, if there was a ring that made one invisible, would an intelligent person have it in them to not use it or not to abuse it? And this is, I think, this is exactly the ring that is later used in Lord of the Rings. So ultimately, Plato's response is, yes, like most people would use it for evil, but to achieve real happiness, one has to control their temptations. So if one took the ring and just went and stole a bunch of food, did all kinds of cruel things, that would be they would be out of control of their senses. And true happiness is in moderation and in control of their senses. So it is possible to be good. And interestingly enough, in, for example, Lord of the Rings, Gandalf refuses to put the ring because he's not strong enough. But I think Frodo, and one of the main lessons in the Lord of the Rings, is that one can control their temptation, and one can wear the ring and still come out of it alive, even though it might be very difficult. And that is sort of a very optimist view of society, and that there is, even if this ring does exist, maybe not everyone, but there are good people out there, and the good will and can overcome the evil, because happiness is contingent on it. If the one who puts on the ring and does all kinds of cruelty, they will be satisfied perhaps, but they won't be happy. That is what Plato hypothesized, and and happiness is derived from controlling one's satisfactions. Therefore, there is good in society. So, yeah, that is Xenophon and Plato. In terms of comparison, so once again, Xenophon sort of was a little bit more harsh on his teacher, Socrates. He thought that Socrates sort of did the wrong thing in not defending himself, whereas Plato sort of believed in everything that Socrates said. In terms of one of the major differences is that Xenophon sort of wrote a little bit more myth. He wrote about centaurs, whereas Plato sort of said not only no myths, he said no literature, some literature, but he thought that he would have probably seen Xenophon's writing to be necessary to be censored, because even though maybe 90% of it might have been good and ethical, there might be one thing that could be interpreted wrong, and that should not be allowed in the state. So quite a difference there. And additionally, some of the more obvious things, Xenophon was more of a soldier. He was a great tactician, whereas Plato, despite being an athlete, he never really fought in too many wars. He did get involved in the Syracuse tyranny, but yeah, in terms, also similarly, they both were not or did oppose the democratic movement in Athens, perhaps maybe to a lesser degree Plato, but Xenophon had said that maybe he wasn't He wasn't an extremist in opposing democracy. He was sort of just kind of a moderate opposition. So, yeah, that is Xenophon and Plato. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you might watch some of the ones I will make in the future. And if you haven't seen any of the previous ones, I hope you watch them too. Thanks so much. Bye.